In this episode, we speak with Cosmo Wolf, Head of Technology at Metronome. We discuss the evolution of software billing and the need for reliability and trust in billing systems. Let's dive in. Cosmo, billing is really becoming a key part of a product experience, especially with usage-based billing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the way that we kind of see it at Metronome, we started with like license-based software. How are we being billed? Like, are we paying for seats that we don't use? What if we have to add everyone on our marketing team for a seat so they can maybe use a product? Most of them don't use it month to month. Like, is that wasteful value? If someone comes out and, for example, launches usage or outcome-based pricing, suddenly that product might be more appealing in the market. And similar, this is also the case for just even visibility into spend. Let's say I'm not even using usage, I'm using seats or something, and one product shows my finance team what seats are active, what I'm being billed for, I can just like literally see my invoice in the product. Another product doesn't. That's an edge that you can help you compete in the market. Similarly, like I think we see this a lot with the AI companies. OpenAI really kind of, I think, led the way in a lot of cases with this, where you can like set up cost controls and per API key, controls, that kind of thing. And you see suddenly that become a competitive edge. And other, now it's like almost any company that's in the AI space is kind of expected to have some amount of like per project spend controls, that kind of thing. That causes now billing to be just as core, or maybe not just as core, but at least on the same ground as any other kind of core product experience. You're evaluating not just what can the product do for me, but how am I getting value from it, how am I paying value for it, and how do I have visibility into that? And that we're kind of seeing across the entire software market, not even just usage, but usage is kind of like forces the question even more.
An issue is with billing inaccuracy, or sometimes you mentioned being charged for seats you are not using. All a great way to get someone very upset and complain about it on the internet and get like a pretty negative, bad PR out of it, which ties very well to the theme of reliability. So why do you believe reliability is super important with billing?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Like when you're using a piece of software, there's kind of two aspects. It's the value you're getting from it and the cost you're paying for it, right? And the value you're getting from it, you sort of accrue and experience, hopefully hour by hour, day by day, like you're using the product all the time. So that's like one side of the equation, right? That's the numerator, I guess. And then you maybe don't think about the billing that much when it's going well, or when you don't feel it's not super expensive, or when money's cheap. But anytime you have to think about billing, you suddenly are putting a denominator into that equation, right? And if you have a bad experience, it can immediately sour any of the goodwill the product has kind of earned from being valuable. Because it's like, like I was getting a ton of value here, but then I get an invoice that's overspending or underspending, or worse, I set up the product to like limit what my spend was, and that limit didn't kick in, so I overspent, or anything, or like I thought I used X and they thought I used Y, and I don't even know which one's right, but now I'm like kind of questioning their core ability to like correctly bill me. And again, that's the billing is like a core part of that. Is really there's like, I think, huge surface area for really high impact mistakes. And like you said, like because that's like the one moment you getting like having to pay that invoice, or swipe the credit card, or whatever the kind of interaction is, that is like a point in time interaction that has the ability to kind of really sour all the positive goodwill your product has earned, even if it was a one-off thing or something like that. It's just like you don't have that many shots on goal to give a really good billing product experience, and so any mistakes there can just really sour customer experience. And that's something we see all the time with our customer base. And one of the reasons that they care so much about billing is because they've recognized of how core that experience is to their users.
We had a guest a few episodes ago, somewhat related, someone from Vercel sharing about customer complaining about fairly spicy bill that they were getting with LLM-based workload, which are very different from the regular web-based workload that we've been handling for the last decades, like which were optimized to be in the millisecond, when now AI-based workloads, sometimes like slower, it's better because we give more time to the LLM to think about it. So they came up with a product that allows the workers to handle other workloads and not pay for idle time while the LLM is providing the answer, which, allowed their customer to avoid these big bills. So yeah, AI is I think brings a set of new challenges in the billing space, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much interesting to talk about just in that one anecdote, right? Like the customer not wanting the kind of surprise bill or the giant bill, the customer maybe being more okay with it if they understood it because it is, fundamentally different than what they're used to with the web-based or, seat-based or whatever they're used to. But not understanding it makes any sort of concern or scariness about it or an order of magnitude worse, basically. And then there's literally like AI is changing how we want to be building. Like what is the right way to be selling these products? That's something where the market is obviously exploding. There's so many AI products out there. And I think people are sort of starting to converge on, token-based pricing for LLMs. But even for something like, image diffusion models, I don't think there's really standard, there's like maybe number of total pixels or image size tiers or something. But like even that, I think we don't even have a great answer to, much less the more novel products like agents or anything like that, where, people are starting with outcome-based pricing, or it sounds like some sort of ability to pause and restart in the Vercel case, which there's a lot of kind of experimentation going on there, which makes, again, all the problems we're talking about being reliable and trustworthy magnified. Because if you are doing something new that makes it hard for people to understand, first of all, how it's calculated, but also if it's calculated correctly, and then they get a big bill, that's like a recipe for disaster, basically. And I think actually the final thing I would add to that is the kind of controls around making sure you don't get a big bill is actually something I think we've seen in the market even as early as, AWS initially, and even still doesn't have like incredible strong cost controls, right? Like a very common story online is, how did I randomly get a giant AWS bill? And I think you see kind of like, I think GCP, for example, launched, and this is more maybe for hobbyists, but it's still an appealing feature, much more strong, like soft and hard cost controls. And that was something that was appealing. I mean, GCP has a very different set of cloud primitives in AWS in some cases, at least when they launched, but people were, especially again, like kind of like the SMB and hobbyist side of the market, switching because of their cost controls. And so, saying that makes sense that, Vercel is worried about that, or any of these people who are experimenting, because it's a good way to win customers if you can have a good story here and a trustworthy story and a reliable story.
Yeah, the salty AWS bill is definitely at this point a meme on the internet, right? Like people just know about that. And I really like one of the strong words that you mentioned in your answer is the word trust. Trust is important at every level in your product, but when it comes to billing, it's especially more important. So when it comes to building a reliable billing architecture, you've been doing this for a while. Do you have advice and guidance for our audience?
Yeah. A lot of kind of different directions to take that, because it all comes down to that trust, right? And so there are things that build trust, like getting the math right. There's things that build trust, like not going down, right? Like if I'm getting my invoice very late, or I have to, keep reloading the page because it shows me an error or something. That's a more kind of a more typical like availability level reliability that I think, folks often talk about. But I think it also comes down to the architecture that you build has to be able to handle the kind of edge cases and changes and things that your internal teams need, because otherwise you end up, if it's like, oh, I signed a new contract for our big customer. That big customer is probably the one that we want to trust us the most because it's the newest, largest customer. But our internal billing system can't represent that. So, oh, well, we got to sign this contract. It's a must-win deal. So we'll just like bill them with some spreadsheets for the first couple of months. And then, turns out the spreadsheets were wrong, which is an incredibly common story. Then it's like, okay, now you have the biggest invoice, your highest revenue, the customer you want to trust you the most, and you're the one billing them compared to like all your PLG customers who are fine. Like that's the worst of all worlds. And so I think there's a couple different directions to take that. Is basically my high level answer. And I think the most important is not losing any data or intent, basically. That's like also the one that aligns pretty well with the kind of classic reliability. In that, so a very common model that we see people build in the market is you maybe are want to bill by CPU hour or something. And so you have all these machines and they're outputting heartbeats or start stop events or something, and you're summing up the CPU hours. It's a lot of data, hopefully if your product's doing well. And so you're like, well, we're not going to, we're billing by CPU hour. We don't need to store all these other dimensions. We don't need to store region maybe, or that maybe you'll store region, but like we don't need to store machine ID or something. And then, at some point in the future, there's some reason that you need that data. Maybe you want to sign a new contract and you want to bill by unique machines, or you have a customer that asks like, hey, my CPU hours seem way higher than I thought they would. Can you help me understand where these are all coming from? And maybe you still have that data in logs somewhere. Maybe you have that data on like cold storage, or you can, have an incident internally and reconstruct it or something. But any kind of data that can't be kind of eventually reconstructed, and any pain or like one-off process you have to do in that case, again, kind of erodes that trust. And in some cases, the trust of the internal teams, right? Like if your account team or your sales team is like, hey, this big client, this big customer they don't believe their bill, and the engineering team can't kind of be like, here's all the raw data, that erodes not only the customer's trust, but your internal team's trust too, which is also bad. I think similarly, another thing that we see in the market a lot is folks who they store some sort of like current state of the pricing and packaging. So you might say like this customer's on this plan, or they're on this plan starting on this date, or they're on this plan and then they migrate to this plan, that kind of thing, all the normal stuff. But depending on, for example, how you want to handle changes. And so if I schedule, a customer to cut over to my enterprise plan at the end of the month because they signed a deal, and then someone else schedules an upsell to buy a new feature mid-month, and then at the end of the month, that doesn't take into account the mid-month change, so the customer loses access or doesn't get billed. That kind of like data kind of overwriting or not stacking well is something that I think is very common and usually manifests in product limitations, where your engineering team is telling your go-to-market team or your finance team, like, we can't structure mid-month upsells or something like that, which loses both that internal trust and, again, external friction or trust. And so, at Metronome, we do kind of a event sourced architecture where we're not actually ever storing, or as a primary data source, the kind of current state of any pricing and packaging. Instead, we're storing all the changes that went into it, and then either at invoice computation time or on some sort of background process, whatever is needed to kind of enable the actual kind of end product. We kind of will compute the exact state at any point in time what the pricing and packaging should be, so that we can always have all the raw data, because we have all the changes that were made. So anything that we need to like, hey, actually it looks like they were added here, removed here, and then added back here, all of that raw data is preserved, and it's not losing any of that when we're storing it. That I think is really, as long as you can store reliably, exactly once process the events, exactly once persist them to storage, keep track of all the kind of like revenue impacting data, you'll be set up to handle kind of whatever you need. But it's a hard problem.
So speaking of hard problem, like monitoring must be like a key, very important part of this type of infrastructure. Do you have like specific advice here?
You're right that it's a key part, especially because for Metronome, we power I mentioned earlier, you want to log into the dashboard, you want to see your invoice, and you want it, to not error or something, right? You want to make sure your usage alerts are getting cut, you're cutting off when people hit certain thresholds and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of monitoring there that is, I would say, not too specifically dissimilar than mature monitoring of any kind of highly available infrastructure product. And so if you're listening to this and you have an infra product of some form, nothing here is going to be super, super novel probably, but to kind of be explicit, what that looks like for us generally is we are logging any sort of like front door API gateway level requests. We log, the start and the end and the params and the response codes and whatnot. And then we are piping those both into kind of Prometheus Grafana to do kind of like real-time dashboards and whatnot that we trigger, alerts and what incidents based on that. But we are also, I think, and importantly, piping them into kind of longer-term cold storage and iceberg tables on S3 that we use to compute internal kind of service health reports. And so every 2 weeks, our engineering leaders meet every team kind of comes with a report of their services. Every service, every product surface area that we maintain has to have internal SLOs, objectives that the teams have to hit. And those all have to be, no, there can't be any like spreadsheet math here, right? That those have to be serviced off of this raw source of truth data. And then they just present them with the horizontal line of like, this is the SLO. And like, if any spike above that has to be kind of root caused ahead of the meeting in most cases. And hopefully there's kind of a SEV or an incident on our side that we can trace that back to. And so we're making sure that we're doing the follow-ups there. So that's a little bit more of like longer term process monitoring. I think that's something that's like, again, maybe a little bit more interesting. I just don't think we're doing a ton super uniquely as far as like our Prometheus, PromQL setups there. But it really just comes down to having kind of full visibility across our entire API surface area and then product surface area, and then holding ourselves accountable for pretty, tight SLOs against that. I think one other kind of thing it's a little bit less monitoring, but is sort of in the same vein, is we have a lot of really core business logic here, right? Like I mentioned earlier, some of the like stacking of upgrades and downgrades and whatnot, even just like the computation of a complex invoice can be a lot of business logic. And making sure we are monitoring for regressions in that logic and making sure that we are not breaking that kind of core kernel of logic is critical, I think, and the performance therein, right? Like if it keeps working, but it's something that was like linear time complexity goes to exponential time complexity, that just breaks in some other way, it shows up in performance numbers or something. So any change that we're kind of making to that core kind of kernel of logic, we back test the whole history of various kind of invoices and pricing configuration from like real world scenarios. It's not just kind of like test fixtures in many cases, and make sure that there's not any regressions in both the outputted data, like given a certain input, what is the output, just normal input output testing there, but also like what is the regressions in performance of this logic. And so that helps us kind of catch things that the monitoring would catch preemptively. And I think that's a really core part to making sure that we trust that core system so that our customers can trust it, so that their end customers can trust it.
How long it takes to run this suite of tests? Is it a long process? Do you do this for every commit?
There's different amounts you can like kind of target. So people can run on a pull request or on a commit in a couple minutes. It'll run like not too different than doing like front end browser testing or something for that area. But then we do release trains every couple of hours, automated. So we kind of like take everything that's been merged across our various repos and services and run kind of external kind of QA where people like literally like logging in and testing various scenarios. And these kind of like automated input out regression and performance testing. I would say the performance testing and the regression testing takes less time than the QA generally takes, but it's on the order of probably under an hour, but more than 15 minutes somewhere in there. And that just kind of gives us trust that everything in this batch of changes is good to go. And because the release train is less frequent than like arbitrary commits or pull requests, we basically just like run more scenarios through the kernel of logic.
So Metronome is doing well. Congratulations on raising a new round of funding with your Series C. What will you do with this funding? What's the future for Metronome?
Thank you. It's an exciting time for Metronome. We want to make it possible for people to compete in the software markets with their pricing and packaging. We want to help billing and pricing and packaging and your just general kind of go-to-market motion be a competitive edge. And so, we've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years pre-Series C building out this kind of core logic that can represent hopefully basically any business model that your go-to-market team or your customers would want needs to be represented. And now I think it's about building the product that enables you to kind of like use that, first of all, in your product easily, and then use the data from that to iterate and evolve and act on kind of your customer behavior and evolve your pricing and packaging. And so for us, it's a lot about making the product easier to get started with and making sure that there's any sort of actionable insights that you'd want to pull out of the product and use to influence your business are easy to get. Any sort of features your customers want around pricing and packaging are easy to build for you, or hopefully you don't have to build anything at all. Like if by using Metronome, you get the feature out of the box, and that's even better. And really just want to enable, everyone to have whatever pricing model their customers or they think are going to help their business do the best. And so that's focus now. It's always been our focus, but we now have a lot of money and momentum behind it. So now it's just bringing that to more and more people.
Amazing. Cosmo, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for chatting about billing. It's a fun space for me to chat about. So thanks.